Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for tuning in here today for a little lecture I'm going to give about how to hack Pathfinder Second Edition. I'm sure many of you recognize me. You know me. I am Jason Bulmahn. I'm the Director of Game Design at Paizo, and was one of the team leaders for Pathfinder Second Edition. What you may not know is that I also have my own third-party publishing gig. I have a little company called Minotaur Games, and through Minotaur Games, I've put out a number of products over the years, third-party products for the game I make during the day. But recently, I came out with a new kind of game, a hack of Pathfinder Second Edition that I'm calling Hopefinder. Now, Hopefinder right now is in the middle of being crowdfunded on Kickstarter to fund a print edition, but the PDF came out in October of last year. Today, what I want to do is walk all of you through the process by which I kind of hacked Pathfinder 2e to be a different game, to serve a different genre, to play kind of differently. So what I'm going to do here today is walk you through all of the steps to get from I've got an idea to I'm releasing a product. I don't think I'll cover too much of the nitty-gritty about how to write or produce an RPG product. There's plenty of other folks who can give you videos on that. What I'm going to focus on here today is how you can manipulate and change and alter and polymorph the Pathfinder 2e core rules engine to create the game that you have in your mind. So, that's kind of the setup. What I want to do here is kind of walk you through understanding the key pillars of Pathfinder 2e. That's the basis of knowledge that you need to get started. Then I want to talk about all the various rules modules that are kind of plugged into the game, because altering and changing these is going to be one of the big things you do in hacking Pathfinder 2e. And then I want to talk about creating the core of your new game and figuring out what you need to put in, what you need to cut, what you need to modify to make everything work. Now, to start off, I suppose we should start off by saying why 2e? Why Pathfinder 2e? There's plenty of game systems out there that you could hack. But I do believe that Pathfinder 2e, at least up to this date, has been kind of underutilized in this front. It is a surprisingly robust game engine with a very solid core that I think is pretty easy to build different kind of rules modules around. It does take some understanding, some expertise to kind of figure out how to do that. But at its core, there is this nice, tidy little rules engine that isn't that complicated for most folks to kind of grok, which, you know, given the right kind of tools and pressures, you could kind of transform into almost anything. And in fact, that's what I did with Hopefinder, which is a modern zombie survival game. That's kind of not the story of Pathfinder at all, you know, because Pathfinder is a game about kind of fantasy superheroes going on quests, whereas a modern survival game is kind of a different genre, a different beast. It wants a different kind of narrative beat and story progression. But we'll get to how we got there here in a bit. Let's start. Let's jump into understanding the key pillars of Pathfinder 2e, because understanding these has to be your kind of first foundational step. Now, if I asked most of you, what's the most important thing in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? A lot of folks would say, well, the 3-action economy is clearly the bedrock of the game. And I would say you're partly right. It's one part of an array of critical rules concepts that all play together to make kind of a quick, fun, engaging, and easy to understand rule system. So at the heart of that, one of the most central components of that actually isn't the 3-action economy, it's the proficiency. So at Pathfinder 2e's heart, there is this universal scaling proficiency. And that system basically says whenever you have a statistic, you are rated in that statistic in one of 5 degrees. You're either untrained, which means you don't know how to do that thing at all. You're trained, you're an expert, you're a master, or you're a legend. That's the kind of base setup. And tied to that is a mathematical formula. And that mathematical formula basically says add your level, add your proficiency bonus for whatever rank you are, 2, 4, 6, or 8, or 0 if you're untrained. and then add an ability score and then some other item and other modifiers. But usually the core is your level, your proficiency modifier, and one ability score. And understanding that that is a central pillar of Pathfinder 2e is half of the knowledge about how the math works. The other half of the knowledge is understanding that monsters don't scale at quite the same rate, right? And that's part of realizing that the math is equating into a narrative structure, right? So as your heroes go up in level, you become more proficient in fighting monsters of your level, especially if you're doing a thing you're focused on. Your math progression outscales the monster's math progression. And this creates kind of an interesting dynamic. The story changes as you go along. You start off needing high rolls and kind of living by the skin of your teeth and hoping that the dice go your way. But at higher levels, you get certain about things. Instead of wondering whether or not you hit, it becomes wondering whether or not you will crit. And that's very intentional. The design of the game makes that experience manifest through the math of the game. So you need to understand that, because these pillars, if you mess with them as part of your hack, you need to understand what the ramifications of that are. So just saying, you know what, all proficiency bonuses are gone. You can do that in your hack, but doing so has a very serious implication on the challenge and the narrative that the players will experience. And maybe that's what you want. Maybe it's not what you want. Maybe instead you want to make superheroes and you want to increase the amount of their proficiency bonus to say that as they go up in proficiency, they become truly super heroic and can kind of do whatever they want. Maybe that's the story you're trying to tell. Possibility. But understanding how these tools exist in the core of the game tells you how you can change them in your hack. So that's one pillar of the game, and I have 4 of them. The second pillar of the game ties directly into that math structure, and that is the degrees of success. In a lot of games, you either succeed or you fail. In some games, you can succeed, you can fail, or you can critically succeed. Well, with Pathfinder, we added critical failure, failure, success, and critical success. And these are, again, an intentional part of the design that isn't just about rolling a 1 or a 20, it's about exceeding the number by 10. And that's actually more important than rolling a 1 or a 20. We wanted the roll of a 1 or a 20 to feel momentous at the table, but the fact that you can exceed by 10 and get the same result is a very important part of the design, because it allows us to kind of overcharge your character over time so that critical success becomes a more reliable component than just getting a 20. So that system which applies to almost everything, but in many cases is one-sided, right? So if you think about attack rolls, most of the time a critical failure doesn't mean anything. That's important because we expect that you'll get critical failures on attack rolls with some frequency because of multiple attack penalty. But in other places, the critical failure is the thing that's really important, like saving throws. And a success or a critical success may not even matter. Now, it's going to matter on basic saves, but in some cases, it's the same result. It just doesn't really work on you. But the fact that there is a broader narrative implication to the dice rolls is really important, because that gives you a broader latitude of kind of mechanical expression on a thing. Think about how some of the spells changed from Pathfinder First to Pathfinder Second Edition. In Pathfinder Second Edition, some of the worst effects were pushed to a critical failure or a critical success on an attack roll or a saving throw. And that allowed us to have these spells kind of still maintain the flavor and essence of what they were, without just kind of being something that we had to look at with a real critical eye about how they could break the gameplay, right? You know, in First Edition, there was this sort of which spellcaster goes first and can make the other side lose their turn, and that's just how the battle goes. We didn't want that in P2, but when it comes to looking at that system for how you can hack the game, you have to keep that in mind when you're playing around with anything that touches the proficiency system, because speeding that up or slowing it down is going to have effects on how often you see those extremes. And those extremes are part of the kind of narrative flow of the game. Okay, so both of those things then play into the action system and kind of modes of play. This is the third pillar. And the third pillar basically talks about how combat is more dynamic because there is a scaling math system that incentivizes characters to target their abilities and effects on the things that they're going to have the best chance of success at, right? So if I'm a spellcaster throwing an area of effect spell, I want to make sure I hit as many of the lower level monsters as possible because they are going to critically fail their saving throws or have better chance of critically failing their saving throws, which means my spell is going to have much more bang for the buck. If I am a high accuracy fighter, I want to cut past those lower level threats and go at the big bad guy because I have the best chance of doing damage to him. That is, in effect, when you start taking that into account with how the action system works and how modes of play works, all of these things start playing together to create a kind of richer tactical environment. And again, this is a place where you can play with your game when hacking Pathfinder to kind of express different things. And we'll get to examples here in a bit. But this is kind of understanding how these three pillars play together, kind of creates this kind of delicate balance of play and narrative and how numbers and math equate into story. There's one last pillar that I think is really important, and you might put this somewhere else, but I actually do recognize this as a pillar of the game, and this is modular character framework, right? If you look at all the character classes, they're modular. They're about kind of plugging in various choices, giving the players an ever-increasing array of options to choose from, but as they do so, their character concept becomes more and more concrete, which means they're being given a broader array of choices, but also they're focusing in on the things that they want to express their character in the way that they imagine. This is a key thing for you as a designer, as someone trying to hack Pathfinder 2e, understanding that this modular framework gives you a wide latitude of ways that you can kind of change up how some aspects of the game play. These components, understanding how you might change feats, how you might change, how the classes express, how you might give different abilities, understanding how these things kind of come together will give you a better understanding of how you can kind of pull the pieces apart and put them back together, right? So those are what I consider kind of the four pillars of the Pathfinder 2e engine. There's a lot more things that are really important to that engine that I wouldn't call pillars. They're either kind of smaller expressions of parts of the game engine, or they're there to help cover for some things that we identified just as a problem. A good example is hero points. Hero points aren't a pillar of the game, but understanding that they serve a very important purpose is critical in your understanding of how to play within the rules engine, right? Because hero points are there to cover up for a streak of bad dice rolls, which is totally possible with the D20. So little secret is that in the game industry that the D20 is actually kind of a terrible die to base big form narratives off of. It's too swingy. It's too likely that you can spend an entire evening rolling poorly. So the hero point mechanic is part of why it's there, is to give players a bit of agency in their, man, these dice are just killing me. I want to do better. Let me burn a hero point and try again, right? Give them another chance to kind of say, no, I'm being hosed by fate. Let me undo that, right? That is a thing that is critical to the game, but isn't something that is so critical that you couldn't remove it or change it and still not have a good game expression. You just need to understand what the impact of that is. Okay, so we talked about the pillars of the game. Those are the pillars. Understanding those is kind of your first step in exploring how to hack and change Pathfinder into another game. The next thing you probably need to understand is what are the major rules modules of the game, because these are the things that you're probably going to swap to make a different game expression, right? So there are a handful of obvious rules modules. I'm going to walk through them, and by the time I'm done, you're just going to go, yeah, we know. Can we move on? And you're right, and that's why I'm going to keep this brief. So rules modules. There are ancestries. This is one of the most basic rules modules. What are you? Where did you come from? Have a small packet of rules. For Pathfinder, this is important to us, which is why it gives some important rules and kind of gives you some choices over your levels, but it's not the most important. So we limit its impact in the play space. Now, you might invent a game where who you are is super important, right? If you were doing a game that everyone was aliens from a different planet, your ancestry might carry much more mechanical weight. You might have more ancestry feats be a part of that because you want the alienness of each character to really express over time. So understanding that this rules module has this much impact in Pathfinder lets you understand that in your game you might want it to have more or less. For example, when we're talking about Hopefinder, everyone's a human because it's a modern survival zombie apocalypse game. And as such, I make the ancestry part of it almost non-existent because it's not about expressing what type of human you are. Everyone's human. So as a result, I minimize its impact on play because it's not as important because everyone's kind of the same, at least. So that's the first rules module. Now we get to the most important rules module for Pathfinder, and that is class. Your class is clearly the most important choice you make as a character. It defines a broad scope of what your character is good at. It gives you the largest bucket of choices over your character's lifespan, and sacrificing some of those choices to diversify and spread out from your class is a key concept in archetypes, and that's how you kind of grab other abilities, right? Classes are clearly the kind of key cornerstone of Pathfinder 2e from the character's perspective, and as such, they get the largest imprint. Again, you might find yourself creating a game where class maybe isn't as important or is even more important, right? And that's one of the ways that you can approach the game engine to make a different play experience. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about that here in a bit, so I don't want to belabor the point, because when we get back to kind of creating the core of your hack, talking about how to work within the class framework or outside the class framework is really key. So I'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it here in a bit. All right. Next up, skills. Skills is a very important rules module in the game. Skills is there to form a universal basis of abilities that all characters can access relatively simply. Unlike class is there to give you incredibly specialized abilities and talents and things you can do during combat. Skills are there to represent the baseline. This is what everyone can do in this game. Everyone has a shot at this stuff if they put a little bit of effort in. And sometimes even if they don't, right? You're just naturally strong and you want to go climb a tree. Okay, right? You don't have to be a legendary climber to get up into a pine tree, right? So skills, I think, are a very important part of Pathfinder in setting kind of a base tone. Again, this is a thing that when you're looking at a hack, if you wanted to, say, create a hack of Pathfinder that was really just like, a roguelike bullet hell, just fight monsters over and over and over again, you might take the skill system and drastically reduce it. Alternatively, if you wanted to create an investigative, horror game, you might expand the number of skills and increase their importance in the game and rely on those more than class ability. So, again, and you're going to hear me repeat this over and over, understanding how these parts are used in Pathfinder and knowing what they're there for is going to help you when hacking the system to make the game into what you want it. All right, next up, Gear and magic items, I group these together because basically it's all about itemization and customizing your character with items. This is just another lever by which characters become custom, right? And in Pathfinder, this also serves as a primary reward structure. So magic items and gear is right up there with XP in terms of how you are rewarded for the things that you do. Let's say you wanted to use Pathfinder 2e to make a superhero game. In a superhero game, you're probably not going to get rewarded with items, right? Oh, hey, congrats. Your Superman analog character just got a better gun. It doesn't quite play the same way. Now, I mean, you could go down the route of, like, there's super technology and stuff like that, but I actually think you probably want to bundle that sort of stuff up more in the character abilities. Oh, you're the character who makes super technology. Let's talk about it that way, and less about what do you find and how much money do you have. In fact, if you were doing a superhero game, you might have to invent an entire new rules module to bolt onto the game to reward the players. You might want to create their, a complex rules bolt-on that talks about their public perception, their how people in the world view them, and that dictates how well they get along with local authorities and how people might help them if they're in a bind, and that becomes kind of a resource they get rewarded with, right, instead of gear or magic. Again, coming back to it, understanding that magic items are part of the reward structure is as important with understanding how magic items actually function from a mechanical sense. If you want to write more of them, go to the Game Mastery Guide to learn that sort of stuff. Go to the core rulebook. What I'm talking about is what they serve as a role in the game and knowing how to manipulate that or change it to fit your needs. All right. Next is spells. Spells are here to serve as kind of game breakers in Pathfinder 2e, but as a rules module, they are a very hefty rules module. They serve to kind of provide an entire subset of abilities that basically allow you to do supernatural things. Again, if you were doing a superhero game, you probably would get rid of spells and replace it with a powers module, a giant list of powers that all characters can get access to. And maybe it might even work similarly, like all superheroes are basically like sorcerers that can use their powers X number of times per day, and then after that they're exhausted. You could invent a superhero system that worked that way. Now you might want to give it more flexibility, maybe because it's a superhero game you want to give characters a lot more uses of their abilities, but you could still build the framework the same way. And understanding that spells are basically that, but for fantasy, is a good way to look at them. So that's spells. Spells, important rules module for a fantasy game, probably something you pull out in others, right? Spoilers, Hopefinder has no spells. If you are in the zombie apocalypse, nobody has spells. Right now, you're lucky if you're eating a can of old cat food, and spells are fanciful nonsense. There are zombies everywhere. So there's that. The next module is monsters. Actually, and I'm going to go ahead and call this the last major module we're going to look at. Monsters form the bedrock of the adversaries that the players are going to face. That is their primary role in the game. I suppose you could bundle traps in here as well, but I actually think they're kind of a minor addendum. Monsters are critical to Pathfinder because they are your adversaries. They are what you are facing off against. And no matter what you do, having adversaries is going to be important. Now, who knows? Maybe instead you want to create a version of Pathfinder where combat is de-emphasized. I think that's a big challenge because I think it goes against the key pillars of the game. But I don't think it's impossible. You could create a cottage core Pathfinder experience where it's all about gardening and building up your house and making relationships with your neighbor. I just think it takes a lot of work. So we've talked about the pillars. These are the kind of central tenets of the game, and we've talked about the modules. And I wanted to kind of get you familiar with both of these concepts so that you could understand that changing modules is something that you're probably likely to do. Changing pillars is the thing you want to kind of avoid doing unless you have to, right? So the pillars are so foundational that if you change them, you will unmake parts of the game in a way that makes a whole lot of extra work for you. I'm not saying you can't tweak them. I'm not saying you can't adjust them. I certainly did, but there are, there's few people in the world who are probably more familiar with the inner workings of the system than me. And even for me, that's a challenging task. By all means, you can do it, but you have to understand that you're starting to deal with dangerous elements, and if you do too much, you may end up with the play experience that there are places where play breaks down, where all of a sudden a character is just too powerful, or the players as a whole find themselves in a spot where they can't compete against the threats that they are facing because something about the game engine has kind of come out of alignment. All right. So we're about halfway done here, and it's time to get to the meat. We've done all the preamble. Let's talk about creating your hack of Pathfinder 2e. Now, throughout this, I'm going to be talking about Hopefinder, because that's the thing I've done most recently. If we got some time at the end, I might explore a couple other possibilities that, are just like, well, if you wanted to do this, this might be how you approach it. But for now, I think what we're going to do is just talk about the steps to kind of create your own hack of Pathfinder 2. Occurs to me, I made it all this way, and I haven't really defined what a hack is. A hack is a game that is still fundamentally the same game, in that it plays the same way. You need an understanding of that game for it to work, but a bunch of it is changed to kind of create a different play experience. You're basically just chopping out pieces, putting in other pieces to make a different play experience, instead of creating a brand new game with its own engine, right? It has points of similarity. If you go far enough, it becomes not a hack anymore, and it becomes its own game. There's nothing wrong with that either. If you're out there making your own games and you take some inspiration from Pathfinder 2e, more power to you. You know where the OGL. This is kind of a game that works more in concert, right? It's a game that sidles on next to Pathfinder and says, hey, if you know Pathfinder, you're going to learn this really quickly, but here are the things you need to know. And that's kind of what Hopefinder is. Hopefinder is, at its heart, a game that if you don't know Pathfinder 2e, you can't play. It doesn't have a combat chapter. I don't bother explaining to you how to roll initiative, because that works the same as it does in Pathfinder. So, all right, that said, let's hop into creating the core of your hack of Pathfinder 2e. So, the first thing you're going to want to do is the same thing you're going to want to do whenever you start any creative endeavor, is just brainstorm up the theme and what you're trying to do. I think this is kind of the spot where you have the most free form. You can kind of imagine whatever you want. I do want to encourage you to try and make it as tight and self-contained as possible. If you go too large, if you go too free form, you can end up in a spot where you just have to change too much. You want to grab a concept that is relatively niche and self-contained, right? So, doing a zombie apocalypse game, automatically I know what the game is and what the game isn't, right? It is a horror survival game. It does feature combat heavily. I already start to know kind of what this game is about just from a couple words. And as we go through this, I'm going to talk about how that kind of got narrowed down and how that kind of led to the game decisions that but this is the point where you can kind of play. You can kind of just daydream and be like, you know what? What if I wanted to make a game about people who bust ghosts or capture ghosts, and drive around in an old, hearse that they paint up, right? I think, you can imagine those sorts of games and start to think about what narratively does that share in common with the core of Pathfinder 2e, and what doesn't it share in common? What things are missing? What things can't you do? Let's say you wanted to do a game of 1920s gangsters versus vampires. The gangsters control the town, you're playing gangsters, and vampires and supernatural nonsense move in. automatically you start thinking, okay, well, it's got combat, that's important, it has skills and things like that. But maybe the stealth system isn't quite what we want. Maybe Pathfinder doesn't have enough of a political system for the gangsters to work in and the vampires to try and corrupt, right? And maybe that's an important part of it, right? Maybe you create a module that talks about the city government and its various agencies and how the gangsters are trying to corrupt them and how the vampires are trying to corrupt them, and ultimately how from above these things are trying to not be corrupted, right? And that becomes this kind of minigame where that's one of the things you do. That's one of the rewards for completing various missions. Like, that could be a thing that you create. If you go back to a game where people bust ghosts, you might say, wow, the thing that's really not here is a robust system for fear. Fear is really important in this game because being afraid of ghosts, or not being afraid of no ghosts, is really important. But the frightened condition isn't going to do it, right? It's too big of a penalty, and it goes away too quick. So maybe you want to pull out that piece and change it, right? So that's kind of your next step. When you're thinking about this theme, start thinking about that theme, and if you were to just try and play it with Pathfinder 2e straight, what would work and what wouldn't work? Now, when it comes to Hopefinder, right, I sat down and I looked at the game, and the first thing I thought was, you know what? Progressive combat scaling, that works for me. The characters getting more powerful as they become more skilled, fighting off more powerful zombies, fighting off bigger hordes, that works. That makes sense for this game. However, where I suddenly started realizing things wouldn't work is there was an element to the math that said the characters get more powerful and the zombies get kind of less powerful over levels. Well, couple different ways I could approach that, but that's clearly a problem. I can't have the players being superheroes killing zombies. That defeats the kind of survival, narrative of an apocalypse game. It's not quite the right fit. It's close, but there's something a little off on it. Maybe there's some ways I can adjust that. Also, the lethality of the game isn't quite where I want it to be. A zombie apocalypse game should be the sort of game where the threat of death is a little bit more present than it is in Pathfinder. That doesn't mean characters don't die in Pathfinder 2e. They certainly do. But I don't think they die quite as often as folks see them die in zombie games and fiction, right? If you've been watching Last of Us, you certainly know that life is fickle and characters can die at any moment, no matter how much you like them. So that sort of thing is an important part of the game system. So when I'm thinking about that, and I'm looking at a zombie modern survival apocalypse game, I also start looking at those rules modules, and I realize I've got a whole bunch that are going to go away, right? There's not going to be spells. There's not going to be magic items. The monsters are going to be radically different. I might be able to keep some, but by and large, they got to go. And even, looking at ancestries, it's like everyone's human because it's set in our world, not a fantasy world. And classes start to not make a lot of sense either, because everyone's a survivor and would teach each other tools and tricks and things. And maybe you're good at some things and not so good at others. So, classes start to come into question and skills become more important because that's the common kind of tool set that everyone has. So, I'm already starting to look at a game where I have to pull out a number of rules modules, replace them with others, right? All of the gear's got to go. No one's going to be using a battle axe. Although, actually, I suppose you could still use a battle axe. It'd be pretty metal. But, you're going to have shotguns and pistols and chainsaws, right? So you got to start putting in room for those sorts of things. And to make room, you pull out magic items, right? No one's getting a flaming longbow. Again, though, that'll be kind of cool. But, all the spells got to go. Most of the monsters have to go. That's kind of where we're at. So, thinking about it from themes, the first thing you want to consider, your next step. So you've kind of narrowed in on your theme. And let's say you want to do, you're doing your busting ghost theme. Not to step on anyone's trademark. You are doing ghost catchers, and you've thought about your theme, you've looked at how it kind of sidles up to the game, and you've started to realize some places where it works and some places where it doesn't work. Maybe classes doesn't make much sense because everyone's kind of doing, if you're playing one of these heroes, you're probably playing a ghost catcher. So you're already starting to go, well, I don't know about the class system. And again, it's set in our world, so maybe everybody's human. Right? And you're already starting to make decisions about how you're going to have to approach these things. But one of the first things you want to consider before you get off in the reeds and start doing, oh, let me start building my ghost catcher class. The first thing you're going to want to do is determine if there's anything you need to do to the pillars of the game. And if it's your first time or you're just figuring it out, I don't suggest you do much. Nothing if you can help it. Right? Don't change the proficiency system. Don't change degrees of success. Understand that whatever character system you're working with, it needs to be as modular and as flexible as what's in there already. Don't mess with the 3-action economy system, right? Leave these things be. But you might find some spots where you're like, well, maybe just a little tweak as a treat, right? And you can start planning those things out. I'll tell you one that I did for Hopefinder. I decided that I didn't want the characters to become super powerful. That was the biggest thing I had to contend with in Hopefinder. So I decided the game only goes to 5th level. It just doesn't go higher than that. The math scaling, you get good at fighting zombies, but you never get great, right? You always end up in a spot where the best you can be is just kind of decent and proficient, and, you can focus on things. But to give the players a bit of an edge, I removed almost all of the level gating on proficiency, right? So again, this comes back to understanding how proficiency works. If you dig into the math, you can't get to legendary proficiency until you're very high level. You can't even get to master until you're about 10. Expert, is coming in at 5 to 7, depending on what thing you're talking about. And I just swept all that away. I said, if you want to invest the resources in it, you can get better at a thing. You can get that +2, +4, +6, +8. But to get to 8, you have to sink your whole character in. And you will be known as the person who is great with that rifle. But you're not going to be good at anything, because you will have to have invested everything in it. So you have to, this creates an interesting choice system for the characters, because looking at the change I was about to make, the first thing I identified as a problem was, well, I'm cutting off a lot of character choice over the entire length of their story. So how can I make the choices that they do make more meaningful? And the way to do that was to make it so that they could decide to go hyper-focus, or they could decide to be broader spectrum, or they could try and do kind of a middle ground where they're a little focused and a little broad, and just give more flexibility in the choices that they make over the play experience and making those more important. And that's how I adjusted the game. Now, in doing so, I also realized that there was a chance that some of my monster numbers might get a little skewed. So I had to kind of rebuild the table that says this is what my expected PC values might be if they're the best they can possibly be at a thing, versus if they're the average thing, versus if they're the worst thing, and then kind of tweak some of the monster numbers as a response, right? So I did have to do a little bit of tweaking. If you pick up Hopefinder and check it out, you will find that when you get to some of the animals, because there are some statistics for animals, there are some that exist in Pathfinder, but their numbers are a little different. Just a little, not a lot, just a little, to make them work a little bit better with what I assume the survivors are going to do. So the other thing that I understood I needed to adjust in the pillars of the game for Hopefinder was I wanted the game to be a little bit more lethal. And to make it a little bit more lethal, I had to adjust kind of a lot of those smaller rules that hook into the pillars of the game but aren't pillars themselves. Hit points, death and dying rules, hero points, those sorts of things. All of those things got tweaks and adjustments. Characters have fewer hit points, but they have armor that gives them damage resistance. Hero points got replaced with hope, and I did that very specifically because hope is an important resource in the game. You get more of it, but if you run out of it, you can be in a very bad spot, especially if you are infected with the parasite that causes people to turn into zombies. That, in fact, is how you die and turn into a zombie, is it drains out your... So these sorts of shifts play into kind of changing the core engine to align it more with my theme, removing the superhero components and making it a bit more grounded, creating characters that are a bit more fragile, and if the dice go poorly your way, you can find yourself dead very easily. So that's kind of the next big step. You've identified your theme, you've compared your theme to the core of the game, you've identified any places where you need to adjust the core pillars of the game. Next up, you want to start taking a real good look at the modules. Determine which ones got to go, which ones need to stay, and which ones do you need to add. So let's say I was doing the Ghost Catcher game. In this game, as I mentioned, I might want a more robust system for fear. So one of the modules I might replace is just the entire kind of Frighten system, right? And I wouldn't call the Frighten system a module, but it's part of the conditions, which is, I guess, a module. And I would say, you know what, I'm going to pull that out entirely, and I'm going to create a new system of fear that, frankly, parallels hit points, right? So fear, as you get more and more afraid during an adventure, you take fear damage, or you build up fear. Your fear meter increases, and if your fear meter ever reaches a certain point, you start panicking. You start taking bigger penalties, and maybe there's even a point where you've taken so much fear that you have to start making saving throws to avoid having, like, a heart attack, right? You can get scared to death, right? So you might look at building a system like that. And what ramifications might that have? Well, it would require some sort of system that plugs into the player experience, giving them control over how good they are at resisting fear, or staving off fear, or recovering from fear. So you'd have to look at that. Maybe there's a skill or a class ability that allows folks to help others overcome their fear. Maybe there's some sort of, empathy or psychology skill that allows you to kind of talk people down from fear. Possible. You would also have to then look at your monster system. And obviously, if you're doing a ghost catching game, you're going to pull out most of the monsters, and you're going to replace them with a broad spectrum of poltergeists, ghosts, spooks, slimes, oozes, all sorts of things, right? And you're going to replace, you're going to add all these supernatural creatures, and in doing so, maybe you decide that they all have a fear aura. That just is a thing they all have, and every round when they take a turn, everybody around them ticks up some fear. Maybe that's how it works. Or maybe it's when they first get revealed, everyone who sees them takes some fear damage, and then they only add more fear when they critically hit someone. Maybe that's how it works. That might work as well. So you're basically starting to look at how you can adjust, shift, change the modules to bring them in line with your idea for the game. So let me talk about Hopefinder, because Hopefinder swaps out a lot of the core modules of the game. First of all, ancestries basically go out because everyone's human, so I minimize that. Classes don't make a lot of sense in a game like Hopefinder. They could have. I could have gone the route of being like, oh, you're the mechanic survivor and you're the medic survivor. But I don't think 5 levels of play is really enough to do, like, deep, robust character choices to make all these classes work. So what I decided instead is that everyone's class is Survivor. And in Survivor, you get a bunch of feats that you get to choose from as you go up in level. Now, there are choices within the Survivor class that might give you access to a certain bundles of feats, but by and large, it is a little classless. You can find yourself sharing a lot of abilities with other people in your party. It gives the group a greater sense of flexibility to kind of cover their bases. Oh, we need someone who's good at doing mechanic stuff. We definitely need some people who are good at combat, and we really need a medic, right? So we don't want to go out there without these things, but you're not shoehorned into only being a medic. As a matter of fact, a lot of medics are pretty good with guns. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of express yourself in kind of a more classless environment. in Hopefinder. Skills mostly got kept, but I added some, right? So there's a computer skill and a driving skill and a machinery skill, right? And these are very useful in living in a modern world. Now, some other skills just went by the wayside, right? Lo and behold, the occult skill doesn't see much use. And some of those just got demoted to lores, right? So if you want to be knowledgeable about the occult, that's fine, but it's now a lore skill. At the same time, some of the existing skills got changed uses, talking back again to changing modules to fit your theme. I didn't want the medicine skill to be as good. Again, I wanted the characters to be a little bit more fragile, a little bit more frail, and that meant the medicine skill couldn't work the same way, so it heals less. In addition, right, one thing that gets added in here, this is a module that I plugged in, was the survival module. And that means that equipment gets can get broken more easily, and characters, even if they're not taking damage, can take bruises. Bruises are harder to heal, and bruises can eventually start giving you penalties, and if you end up with way too many bruises, they can even knock you out. So there are systems in the game that add these kind of survival elements, right? Talking about skills, I changed the craft system because your gear gets damaged and destroyed a lot more easily. So you have to repair it. You have to look at ways to fix it, or you have to be willing to replace it more. And that all comes down to the systems of doing dings. I get rid of kind of hit point damage to items. We're not doing any of that. But instead what we're doing is saying that items can take so and so many dings before they're broken, and then they're still usable while they're broken, but once they go all the way, then they're destroyed and they're no longer functional at all. So this is, again, taking existing modules, either adding to them, subtracting to them, or replacing them to make them fit the theme you have in your head. If I were doing my ghost catching game, I might, change the skills to, obviously I'd want some sort of knowledge skill about ghosts and the paranormal. And maybe, again, we talked about having some sort of skill to help you recover from frights and fear and other things, right? That might be a skill that you add, because medicine you may not want to bundle that up with medicine, because it is kind of a different thing. Gear and magic items, this is going to be something you're going to change very frequently unless you're doing another fantasy. If you're just doing a hack of P2 that is a different flavor of fantasy, you can probably keep this module. But if you're doing anything else, this module probably has to go. Obviously, in Hopefinder, I pulled the whole thing out and replaced it with guns and modern weapons and modern armor and all that sorts of stuff. But, in a superhero game, you might pull it and replace it with almost nothing, because gear isn't important. In the Ghost Catchers game, you're going to change it to a pretty limited scope of ghost catching gear, and maybe even then, you don't make it something the players buy, because they're the ones inventing it. So instead of paying for it in money, you have to, there's a whole bunch of things you can create, and between games, you have so and so much inspiration time that you can use to just make the things, and that's how you do itemization in a Ghost Catcher. I don't know. To be clear, I'm not actually planning a Ghost Catchers game. So if you want to make a Ghost Catchers game, let me know, and I will buy it. I'm gonna end up having to buy 14 Ghost Catchers games. All right. That's how you go through all the modules. Spells in Hopefinder went, because there's no spell casting, and the monster chapter got almost entirely replaced, because I wanted to add a whole bunch of interesting zombies, from crawlers to runners to infested to hulks to overminds to all sorts of weird things. That doesn't mean I couldn't use the zombies from P2. I certainly could, but in this case, I wanted zombies that were a little more emblematic and had some interesting abilities. There's leapers that can jump at you. There's the infested ones that can spew cones of parasites at you. You don't want any of that stuff. But that's the kind of fun stuff. And then, of course, I also included a bunch of raiders and animals and zombie animals and all sorts of things, right? But that's basically me just replacing them all. All right, we're almost there. We're in the home stretch now. You've thought of your theme, you've compared it to the game, you've done some shifts to the pillars, you've replaced a bunch of modules, you've written new content to replace things that doesn't work, that brings it all closer to your theme. You're basically at the point now where all that you really need to do is kind of figure out how you're how your narrative and story plays with all of it. Now that you've got those pieces in place, you can now start kind of envisioning how the narrative of the game fully embraces those things. You can go back and make more tweaks if you realize the narrative isn't quite playing the way you want, right? You know, I have to admit, when I was designing Hopefinder, there's a number of times I had to go back to design because I wanted the story to go a certain way. Especially when it came to the mechanics behind hope, because I wanted the parasite to drain your hope. And there was a couple different rules expressions of that before I finally settled on the one I did. But this is also where you're going to want to add things to your hack that aren't just mechanical, right? I do think you want to have an idea what this stuff is early, but you don't actually want to set any of it in stone until you can do so in a way that matches your mechanics. So for me, that was creating like a piece of fiction. That was writing a gazetteer for the city of Seattle, writing a history of the plague. If you were doing a Ghost Catchers game, it might be like creating the Ghost Catcher manual and treating it like it was a job and starting up making the character sheet look like a job application, right? It's using your theme to express fiction in a way that's fun and engaging. If you're doing the 1920s gangsters versus vampires game, you might want to start out by kind of writing a piece of fiction from the perspective of these gangsters, doing a run of moonshine, illegal moonshine, only to have their delivery people be vampires and attack them and kill them all, right? You might want to write an engaging piece of fiction to set up the story, right? I do think there's some fun stuff with that. You might even create a curated list of 1920s music and include that in your game as like, hey, play this stuff. This stuff will fit well with your game. It's in theme and it works well, because you might want to decide that music is an important part of that because it does set it in that era so well, right? So building and fleshing out your story is a super important part of kind of making your hack come to life, because you're stepping away from the kind of fantasy shared headspace that everyone has when they come to Pathfinder. So you have to replace it. You have to put your story in there. You have to spend the time to create it. It doesn't have to be a lot, especially if you're leaning on tropes that everyone is aware of. I didn't have to put a lot for folks to imagine a zombie apocalypse. That's so common in media. I just had to touch the surface. I just had to give you the timeline, kind of give you a gazetteer, give you some fiction, but it's not a lot. Not in the grand scheme of things. So you're really, at this point, you're into kind of finishing touches. Finishing touches is, making an interesting character sheet because you've changed a bunch of stuff. Looking at what parts of your game you're going to put into the open license. With Hopefinder, I put a bunch of the narrative terms into the open license. I declared them as open content so that you can create your own narrative for how the Z-Plague started where you live, because I want to encourage you to tell your own stories in this world. I did Seattle. I'd love to see what happened in New York. I don't know. I didn't decide it. I'm going to let you all do it. But you can do that with your game too. You don't have to, but you can. You also just want to look for ways to make your game kind of more fun and appealing. The world is your oyster. What do you want to add to make it exciting? Does it include, a 1920s gangster wanted poster, right? You can put those things in, and they're just fun. But instead of it being a 1920s gangster, maybe it's a vampire that the gangsters are hunting, right? There's things that you can do like that kind of bring the game to life and make it pop in the imagination of the players and the people running. So that's really kind of what you want to focus on. And that's kind of it. Folks, that is how I made Hopefinder. I hope you have found this lecture to be informative. I was happy to take part in Third Party Kon and talk to you all about Hopefinder. As a reminder, you can find Hopefinder right now on Kickstarter. It is live. I'm crowdfunding the print edition. So if you're interested in picking up Hopefinder, you can do that right now. PDFs and print editions are available through that crowdfunding campaign. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we will see you next time.